if you're an Iranian Kurd, well, of course, you'd probably quite welcome American support, but you'd also be rather skeptical about it because you've seen how just earlier this year, your ideological compatriots in Syria were effectively abandoned.
That is what has happened in the past. The Americans try and instrumentalize the Kurds and then they betray them. Some people would say that it's better to see the true face of a superpower.
Regime change, they know that the only way they can actually make that happen is to send boots on the ground in. I think that would be a political disaster for them.
Hello and welcome to the Fourcast. I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy in Tel Aviv. There is a big focus now on whether there may be an element of ground war in Iran because there is speculation that the Kurds in northern Iraq might get involved. It's been sort of denied by the Americans, but there is clearly a rationale for the Kurds moving into a part of Iran and at least distracting the Iranian military. At the same time, the conflict is spreading to all sorts of other countries. There have been attacks in Azerbaijan. The Gulf states continue to come under fire. Turkey is still, reeling, I suppose, after drones were fired at it yesterday. And there is this growing sense that this is a war that is not in anybody's control. Our international editor Lindsey Hilsum is in Beirut, Secunder Kermani is here in Israel, and Anushka Asthana is in Washington. Let's begin with this whole question of the Kurds. Now, the Americans have denied that they are trying to arm the Kurds and inspire an invasion, and there have also been some voices from that region saying, well, we're not going to move anywhere until the skies are clear. Secunder, what is going on there? Why would the Kurds be the answer to a ground war?
Well, look, let's reiterate, first of all, what everyone has been saying for a long time, and that it's very difficult to affect regime change or even perhaps really bring a regime to its knees, if not topple it completely, through air power alone when you are dealing with a regime with the kind of staying force and the kind of history behind it of the one in Iran. So it would make sense. You can understand why America and Israel would be looking for some kind of proxy force on the ground. And the Kurds, well, there are Iranian Kurdish groups that have been based across the border in Iraqi Kurdistan for a long time. They have been fighting against the government, although not particularly actively, I have to say. It was not a particular hotspot, nor are they particularly large. We're talking about in the thousands rather than the tens of thousands in the terms of the number of fighters. Speculation about their role really grew after President Trump had some conversations with Iraqi Kurdistani leaders and then was reported to have had a conversation with Iranian Kurdish political leader as well. And reporting suggests that the CIA has been working on smuggling in weapons to Iranian Kurdish militia members for some months now. The Israelis had a close relationship with the Kurds in Syria, as did the Americans up until recently before abandoning them. And that gets to one of the hearts of the problem, which is that if you're an Iranian Kurd, well, of course, you'd probably quite welcome American support, but you'd also be rather skeptical about it because you've seen how just earlier this year, your ideological compatriots in Syria were effectively abandoned after having been used by the Americans as the main counterweight to ISIS for many years.
Can I be the person who takes us back to 1991 when the Americans and the CIA primed the Kurds to overthrow Saddam Hussein? They trained people, they gave them weapons, and at the very last minute, they decided that wasn't a good idea after all. And so the CIA people, the Americans, left, and all the Kurds who had cooperated with them were slaughtered by Saddam Hussein. Because that is what has happened in the past, that the Americans try and instrumentalize the Kurds and then they betray them. So this would not be, for the Kurds, the first time they've had this kind of invitation, but they will also have long memories.
And as Secunder points out, they have just been dumped by the Americans in Syria, so their trust levels must be very low.
They always are. No friends but the mountains. That's what the Kurds always say.
Just to jump in, we are hearing noises from the figures there on the border that they would be willing to engage in this fight, but a lot of skepticism from others about how effective really they could be. And also a lot of skepticism voiced by other Iranians who are anti-regime but worry that some kind of civil war that would inevitably really erupt could end up in perhaps the real fracturing of the country, something they definitely don't want to see.
And Anushka, in Washington, they're denying it.
Well, I mean, they're not outwardly saying it's happened, but those phone calls have taken place. When Caroline Levitt, the press secretary, was asked about it this week, she basically admitted that this is the sort of thing they're considering. And the reality is, if, as Sek was saying, they want to achieve this from the air, and they do, even though they're not ruling out boots on the ground, I think it would be a political disaster for Donald Trump if it ended up with boots on the ground. There is only one way, therefore, to try to get to regime change. I know they're now not saying regime change on the central goal list, that sort of dropped down the list for them. But ultimately, Donald Trump said it this week. He said the worst case scenario is they replace Khamenei with someone who's just as bad. And that's what they are looking at if they don't manage to foment some sort of, uprising within the country. I think the problem, and I was speaking to someone who was in the Biden administration looking at these same decisions, is that all the projections that America has made in the past about where you end up if you strike Iran in this way is with a more hardline administration. Actually, in a country of 90 million with not an organised opposition, it isn't obvious that what they're suggesting with the Kurds is going to result with what they want. And that's why the Kurds are very nervous about it, even if they are willing to try to start to foment something.
Lindsey, it takes us to the central question about regime change and to what extent it is a goal and an achievable goal. There is a sort of a difference now, as Anushka points out, in the public statements between Washington and Israel. Israel mentioned it, right at the top all the time. Washington have kind of dropped it down the list and aren't talking about it as much. Isn't it likely that the Americans will want to drop out before the Israelis?
Well, the Americans may have different goals from the Israelis. And as you say, it seems that different Americans have different goals. But what we know of Donald Trump is that he likes conflicts that are quickly resolved. Venezuela was perfect for him. It took a couple of days. The leader left. They found a compliant substitute, and on we go. And he thinks he's going to get a lot of oil from it. But I think that what you have to think about with Iran is it's not just a regime. It's a state. It's the Islamic Republic. So it's not as if taking the head of the snake off changes the snake. The snake remains. You have the courts, you have the bureaucracy, you have the prisons, you have the whole Islamic system. It's not just a government. And that, I think, is something which makes a huge difference, because you can't just bring in somebody else, I don't know, the son of the Shah, Pahlavi, to come and be a new leader, because the whole system is different. So you have the Revolutionary Guard. They are the ones who are, they're not like an ordinary army, which would serve any government, as you would find in most countries. They are an integral part of the revolution, of the Islamic State. And so that makes this idea of regime change much more difficult and much more complicated.
Secunder, the Israelis are claiming there's no difference between them and the Americans, but it is increasingly seeming as though there is a difference in their ambitions. Is there any world in which, the Israelis just carry on, even if the Americans don't?
I think that's probably unlikely, because what would probably bring the American role in this war to an end would be Donald Trump's fears over global oil prices, global gas prices, for example, stuff that we're already seeing, we're seeing rise. Israel's position on this has long been that they want to see the end of the Iranian regime. You speak to ordinary Israelis, and for them, even while some of them at least may have been conflicted over the war in Gaza, this war with Iran is something that has pretty much universal support across the political spectrum as well. And that's because many Israelis believe that a nuclear-armed Iran is an existential threat. Now, of course, you can debate how close were the Iranians to creating a nuclear bomb. Is the best route to preventing that through war, or is it through the kind of diplomatic channels that we saw under Obama when Iran signed this Jack Power agreement and actually stopped enriching uranium for a long time until President Trump pulled out of it? So you can have those discussions, but certainly I think for the Israelis, whatever happens now really is something that's in their favor. You've already seen a huge amount of firepower directed at the regime. The Israeli Air Force talking about 5,000 bombs, I think, already. Obviously, that number going up by the hour, effectively. And so you've seen their ballistic missile capabilities badly damaged, presumably also their nuclear capacity. Of course, you know, the supreme leader, many other leadership figures killed as well. So perhaps, you know, the Israelis had this term for what they used to do in Gaza. It's rather terrible. Prior to October the 7th, they would say that we are mowing the lawn with our airstrikes targeting Hamas. Perhaps it's something that they're doing, you know, in that ilk with Iran, where they're not trying to, or they know that they may not be able to topple the regime, but they can certainly weaken it, set it back years, if not decades, in posing a threat and its dominance in the immediate region.
Anushka, why does regime change slip off the Trump list so quickly? I mean, he mentioned it very upfront on Saturday, and then almost immediately the administration started saying regime change is not our goal.
Well, I think partly because they're realising that regime change might not be as easy as perhaps they originally thought. And also, when you're listening to the motivations of Donald Trump, he doesn't always say out loud what he's thinking behind the scenes. Look at Venezuela. In the run-up to Venezuela, he did talk about democracy for the Venezuelan people. In the weeks and months afterwards, he didn't use the word once. It became very, very clear what his goal was there, and it was to do with oil. I think in this situation, as Sek is saying, really, the outcome, the best positive outcome that they are now sort of corralling around is the fact that they've hugely degraded the missile programme, perhaps made a nuclear programme something that will not get off the ground again, and also decimated the Navy. And those are the three things that they talk about all the time now. And regime change, they know that the only way they can actually make that happen is to send boots on the ground in. And as I said, I think that would be a political disaster for them. That said, very clear that they would still like to see a situation where you ended with that. But the complexities of it are much more difficult than you thought. And even if they can point to that positivity, which is undoubtedly positive in Israel's point of view, many would say the Obama deal was giving you that same sort of security. Obviously, Donald Trump himself didn't agree with that.
But the other thing is they're talking less and less about the Iranian people. Because remember, it was only last month that hundreds of thousands of Iranians were out on the streets protesting. Donald Trump said, oh, we're going to come in and we're going to save you. We are there on your side. Well, are they talking about that now? Well, less and less. And we know that the history of the world tells us that regimes do not fall on the whole because people come out and peacefully protest. Regimes fall when the men with guns refuse to kill the people who are out on the streets. And at the moment, that is being talked about less and less.
And I think it's really important to note that the internal projections of the American government were that this sort of operation would leave you with the IRGC with more control. They thought that this would eventually lead to a more hardline regime in Iran.
Right, let's talk about the thing that's really got so many viewers really worried, which is the spread of the conflict and the way that the war is affecting people to more and more countries, why that's happening and where it might go next. Lindsey, a lot of people have been tempted to describe this as chaos. It doesn't strike me as chaos at all. It strikes me as quite strategic and effective.
Yeah, I don't think it is chaos. I mean, let's look at it from the two sides. So I'm in Lebanon. So what Israel is doing is they are bringing the war here to Lebanon, where it's been before, to try and destroy Hezbollah, which is one of Iran's proxies. Now, Hezbollah, what they are doing is they're firing into Israel, and they said there was a big speech by their new leader, Naim Qassem, last night, saying that they were doing this in order to avenge the killing of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. So we see it spreading here. But then, What about Iran? Iran has decided that the best way to counter the threat or the attacks from the US and Israel is to try and strike the Gulf countries. Now, the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and so on, they are all closely aligned with America, and under Trump, particularly closely aligned. And the Iranians and the Gulf countries, they've sort of they've never been friends, but they've sort of managed to make some kind of peace over the years. And now the Iranians have decided what is best for them strategically is to blow all that up, because that endangers foreigners, particularly Westerners who are in those countries, and it brings those countries into the war. But I think that where there is a level of chaos is that then you see all these sort of extraneous countries being brought in. For example, 3 drone strikes from Iran on an airport in Azerbaijan. Now, I'm not quite sure where that fits in or why. And then the possibility of and then, attempted strikes over Turkey, and then you have Cyprus. And this is why this is so dangerous, because although you can start a war, as the Americans and the Israelis have done, stopping a war is much more difficult, and controlling a war is much more difficult, because, every soldier knows that, the plan of battle rarely survives contact with the enemy.
Secunder, I suppose the question is Iran's aim to actually spread the war, or to get those countries to pressure the Americans to stop?
Exactly. It's something that me and you have been talking about a lot over this week, haven't we, Krishnan? It seems that's very much a deliberate strategy, where Iran thinks that the best pressure point to place on Donald Trump is the Gulf countries. And that's because, one, as Lindsey was pointing out, they're close allies, but also because they're key hubs for oil, for gas. We've seen prices soaring on both commodities. They're also places where America has a lot of regional bases as well. And they're not used to this kind of conflict. I mean, Israel, for example, is, but in the Gulf they aren't, nor are the expats who live there, many of whom are Western. So I think Iran's strategy was, if we can increase the cost on the Gulf, they in turn will put pressure on President Trump to end the war sooner rather than later. One Arab diplomat I was talking to said, actually, look, it's a miscalculation by Iran. What they've done is they've really rallied the region against them. And remember that a lot of these countries had publicly, in the lead up to this war, been putting some kind of, or at least privately, putting pressure on President Trump not to go down the military route, and to try and give diplomacy a greater chance, because they feared instability here. So, I mean, I think long term, this could be, quite a miscalculation by the Iranians, but they must feel that right now this is, a now or never moment. It's do it or die for them. And so they're throwing everything they have at kind of pretty much everywhere they can, in an effort just to raise the cost and hope that President Trump draws back, because they think if they can keep going, keep on with the chaos, the American will bend before they will crumble. It's a variation on the Taliban strategy, where they used to say, you have the watches, we have the time.
But Lindsey, I mean, it's not clear, is it, that it's a go-down fighting strategy either? They're not throwing absolutely everything at everyone in a way that would invite a massive response, an overwhelming response from the Americans, which suggests that they are doing everything they can to stay in place and to sort of manage the conflict, if that's at all possible.
Yeah, I mean, what they've said is that they are calibrating, and that they are firing what they have at the top of their stockpile at the moment, but they have much more beneath that. Now, we don't know whether that's true or not. But the other thing they're doing is that they're using their proxies strategically. So at the moment, they're using Hezbollah, which is the proxy which is closest to them. One of the points of doing that is to partially tie up the Israelis. So the Israelis are busy firing here into Lebanon, where I am, and that may take some of their resources away from attacking Iran. But then you have the Houthis from Yemen, and then you have different kinds of Shia militia in Iraq. Now, they haven't really been deployed yet, and it's possible that the Iranians are keeping them in their back pocket. Having said that, I do think that there is quite a lot of bravado on the part of the Iranians, and I'm not really quite sure how much strategic depth they've got, how many missiles they've got, how much longer they can keep going for. There are some reports which are saying that they are firing a bit less now than they were in the early part. So obviously they want to make the Americans and the Israelis think that they can keep going. They've got a lot more out there. They can attack US and Israeli assets across the world, that they can use terror tactics, they can use everything. And the coming days will show whether that's true or not.
Anushka, we spent quite a lot of time over the last few days sort of asking how is the war being directed in Iran and who by? I wonder whether we should ask the same question about the United States. Because we've seen, apparently strategic decisions being announced by Pete Hegseth, going after the man they believe was in charge of trying to target Donald Trump in the past. I mean, how much is this now operationally handed over to the US military? How much is still political direction?
Oh, well, I think it's definitely both. I think Dan Kane has had a very important role in all of this. And when you're actually listening to it operationally, it really feels like he's the person who's taken control. I mean, it's quite something to watch Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War, as they now call him, talk about this, because he speaks in a way that I've sort of never heard a Defence Secretary talk before. I mean, when he was talking about that killing of the person he said had attempted an assassination on Donald Trump back in 2024. He used language like Donald Trump has had the last laugh. When he was talking about taking out the Iranian warship, he said, they thought they were safe in international waters. He's basically gloating about the idea that they don't care anymore about the rules of engagement. The issue is not everyone around the president agrees with that, and some of them are thinking politically about their own futures. So we have a situation in which J.D. Vance, the vice president, had argued against this. Just before the election, he was saying attacking Iran would be a mistake because of the cost of it. And already, although the Pentagon won't confirm it when we go to them, people are reporting this could be costing the American exchequer $1 billion a day. Then you've got Marco Rubio, who's been trying to make and then having to backtrack from making the actual legal argument for why they're doing this suggestion that there was an imminent threat because Israel were going to strike anyway. Reports today suggesting he's the one who's urging most strongly against boots on the ground. And then the ultimate person in charge of all of this, no question about it, Donald Trump himself, with fewer advisors around him than he would have had in the past, trying to restrain him on this. And I think it is really interesting when you listen to his press secretary, Caroline Levitt. They're absolutely not ruling out going further on this in a way that would have felt politically difficult for them not that long ago.
Lindsey, you were nodding. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, I was nodding that, but I was also, because I was thinking about the legal side of it, and I'm glad Anushka mentioned that, the Marco Rubio trying to, find some kind of justification which could be, work in law. Because when you go back and let's think about 2003, the Americans did make an attempt. They went through initially the United Nations. They did create a coalition. The British were amongst that, and then there were many other countries which were amongst that, and the same was true in Afghanistan. So many people said that both of those were illegal wars, but there were legal arguments which could be made, and they brought other countries online with them. Now, this time there is no attempt really to make a legal argument, except, as you say, a little bit by Marco Rubio. And the danger of that, and the reason why European countries are very concerned, is because that creates chaos across the world. If Western countries say it's illegal for President Putin to invade Ukraine, if they fear President Xi Jinping ordering an invasion of Taiwan, they have absolutely no legal legs to stand on. If the Americans are going around in this swashbuckling way, using the brutish language that Pete Hegseth has been using, talking about death and destruction, saying that they have the right pretty much to do whatever they want and to kill whoever they want, and to glory in the idea of killing people. as opposed to being sober about the seriousness of war, the danger of war spreading, the horror of killing people, whether they are combatants or civilians. The language we're hearing from America is a totally illegal, unlegal language, whether or not you can justify what they're doing in law. And this changes the whole way the world works.
Look, on this question of international law, Anushka, it is very, very striking that America just seems to be making very little attempt to care about it and is poo-pooing the legal concerns of people like Keir Starmer and others in Europe. I mean, is there sort of universal agreement about that within the administration, let alone the rest of American politics? And do they not worry that this is an attitude that could come back to bite them?
I mean, I think there are different opinions on that, and it's clear that they are grappling with this behind the scenes to some extent. Partly that's why we're seeing the different justifications. Marco Rubio trying to make a legal case, others not bothering to do so. Like is always the case with war, you can make a moral argument, as they did with Iraq, but they still try to make the legal argument as well. Pete Hegseth, we know historically that he wants to laugh in the face of international law, frankly, and we're hearing more of that in this situation right now. I think it is clear that they are trying to argue that there is an imminent threat. That debate is being had in Congress as well. That's what Democrats and a few Republicans are bringing to the floor in the Senate and then today in the House. And those arguments are being had. But the problem is once you have started an invasion, then there's the kind of patriotic wash that comes over Congress that doesn't really allow people to make those arguments in the same way that they would have done before. That said, it is clear that they are trying to make the argument of an imminent threat behind the scenes. I did find the kind of naval warship and the way they blew that up really questionable. And I was speaking to a number of military contacts about this yesterday, trying to understand what is the legality of that. And I think there's two things to say. One is it is not legal, and clearly Britain did not consider it to be legal, to fire at a ship when it is in international waters, on the one hand. On the other hand, the Americans will be trying to make the argument that because they say they faced an imminent threat, the entire war is therefore legal, and taking out the Navy was part of the goals.
I mean, Lindsey, the thing that struck me about that was the human reaction and how much the world has changed, even since things like the sinking of the General Belgrano before the Falklands War, when there was, genuine, outrage, really, and pain at the idea of just the mass killing of a bunch of sailors who were sailing away from the Falklands. This was a ship that was 2,000 miles from Iran. There's been very little international outcry, really, about the idea of sinking that ship.
Very little. And there's been not a lot of outcry about the killing of so many children in a nursery in Minab in Iran as well. I think that this is the world which the current American administration has taken us into. It's a world where might is right and where they laugh in the face of the suffering of the people who they think deserve to die. I'm not talking about the children there, I'm talking about the sailors on the ship. But some people would say that it's better to see the true face of a superpower than for them to dress up what they do in euphemisms. And certainly I don't think that the Trump administration has any shame in showing its true face. What it does do is it makes things very difficult for Europe, because Europe is a place where we rather like euphemism, don't we?
Exactly. Yes, I mean, Secunder, it also strikes me that Europe's going to have to make a much better case for international law and a rules-based order, because at the moment, both the Americans and the Israelis are just poo-pooing it and saying, well, what did international law ever do for us? And of course, the Russians, don't care about, international institutions either. Interestingly, the Chinese claim to be the upholders of international rules-based order, but we'll have to see what happens when it comes to Taiwan.
Yeah, I mean, I also struggle to think of that many tangible instances where I can think of countries around the world really restraining themselves out of concerns over international law, as opposed to being seen to have the moral high ground or perhaps the economic impacts of their decisions. So I think sometimes some of these discussions can sometimes be a little abstract. I mean, what I'm also kind of interested in trying to understand more about is what people in Iran really think, to the extent that you can kind of, summarize the views of a 90 million plus population like that. But certainly prior to the war starting, we were hearing a lot of voices from people who were anti-regime, and all the research shows that the vast majority of the population are anti-regime, that they were in favor of strikes, that they wanted anything that would help them overthrow this regime after that very bloody repression of protesters back in January. Now that the reality of the war is kicking in, now that we're seeing these huge amounts of strikes, with a human rights group that's widely seen as credible is talking about over 1,000 civilians being killed, I'm not clear what those people now think. We have seen videos of, filmed by Iranians of blasts taking place, targeting, IRGC, Revolutionary Guard buildings, where they're being cheered on. We saw, of course, people out on the streets cheering and celebrating the death of the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. But we've also seen large numbers of pro-regime supporters coming out onto the streets. That's something that surprised Iranian activists that I've been talking to. It even surprised a former Mossad a specialist on Iran that I was talking to here. And I wonder whether there's been a shift now within the Iranian population as a result of the reality of this war, or if, as some in the diaspora say, they still want to see the end of this regime no matter what.
Anushka, let's just briefly talk about the domestic politics here as well. I mean, what does Trump think he gets from this, and how does it affect the midterm elections in November?
I think the reality of that is probably more nuanced than you would think on the surface. On the surface, some very, very senior MAGA commentators, or I say senior, but I mean, kind of people like Megyn Kelly and Tucker Carlson, who have huge audiences, are very, very critical of this, particularly the idea that this is not to save American lives, that it's to save Israeli lives. And I think that will have an impact and it will feed down. But in terms of his voting base, at the moment, it still divides very much on partisan lines, although overall the country is wary of this, doesn't think that America has made the argument for this invasion. I've noticed that Republicans are much, much more likely to back the operation than Democrats are. I've been speaking actually over the last week to some of the type of voters that Trump will be most worried about. And I was quite surprised. They weren't kind of, no, let's definitely not go into Iran. They were like, if we go into Iran, it has to be very targeted. It has to be very focused. And what they would be very, very uncomfortable with, and that's why I think they're, administration will be very wary of going there, is the idea of boots on the ground. If this starts to feel like it seeps into a forever war situation, then I think it becomes very problematic for Donald Trump. But Donald Trump has not shown that he is not interventionist. We keep making this point. He has, launched strikes at an enormous number of countries now. He likes the idea of showing off the military might of America. And as yet, I don't think it's having a huge negative impact on his voting base. I think there is a high risk that it tips into that, particularly if Democrats can make their arguments. Why aren't you focused on the American economy? And particularly if it starts to affect gas prices.
And Secunder, for Netanyahu, it's a win-win, isn't it?
Absolutely. This is an election year. Many thought after the October 7th attacks, initially at least, perhaps Prime Minister Netanyahu, rather a Teflon figure, this was it for him and he wouldn't be able to survive. But in fact, his rating in the polls has rebounded, and it seems very possible, if not definite by any means, that he will win the elections again. Certainly some kind of positive outcome from an Israeli perspective in regard to this war would help him yet further in that. And I remember seeing an interview that you did, Krishnan, with the opposition politician Yair Lapid, and even he couldn't bring himself to criticize what Netanyahu's doing, despite being his main political opponent. I think that's very telling.
Lindsey, let's just gaze ahead a little bit. I don't know how far forward you're comfortable forecasting. Where do you think this is going in the short term, at least?
In the short term, I don't see this ending particularly quickly. I think certainly here in Lebanon, both Hezbollah and the Israelis want to keep going, and I think that they will keep going. I think that from the American point of view, it's very hard to see how it stops since they can't quite decide what their objectives are. But I think that what we need to bring it back to is Iran and the Iranian people. I remember being in Baghdad before that war. The Iraqis I knew were desperate for regime change. They were desperate for Saddam to fall. They had spent, many of them who I knew had spent so long in prison, they had been tortured. They thought nothing could be worse. Similarly in Libya, all Libyans I knew, they just wanted Gaddafi to fall. They just said, let this be over. This is the worst thing. I'm hearing the same from Iranians I know. Iranians saying, this is the most terrible thing that could ever happen. I understand that, and I see their point of view. The only thing I would say is sometimes you have to be aware of what you wish for.
Lindsey, on another level, look, I mean, I've got a lot of people, saying, is this going to explode? Is this World War III? To be honest, I often say, well, I think World War III began in 2023, and didn't you notice? But, the stakes in terms of how this could grow and affect, even people back home beyond prices, still seems very scary for a lot of people.
I think it is scary because they let off something that they can't control. It's the way we live in the world. It's the way people travel, people go to the Gulf, the integration of the world economy. People my age have children who live in all of these different places. How safe is it going to be for that to continue? We see this ship off Sri Lanka. We're now bringing in Southeast Asia as well. There are so many different ways in which a war like this can spin out of control, and that affects everybody's life.
Thank you all very much indeed. That's the forecast. Until next time, bye-bye.